Hey, in this brief bonus video, I would like to talk about a few essential preferences in Photoshop. Now, Photoshop includes gazillions of preferences, most of which are not very critical. But there are a few that I find I really like to change. So let's take a look. First off, if you have more than one image open, you'll find that those images usually show up as separate tabs in the interface of Photoshop, where you have to click between them to switch between your various documents, like I have here, 3 documents open. Well, if you don't like the concept of tabs because you want to be able to see more than one picture at the same time, first off, you should be aware that you can go to the Window menu. And within the Window menu, there's a choice called Arrange. And you could say you want so many images to appear side by side, vertically. In this case, I'm seeing all 3 images side by side. Because a lot of people just get a little confused because they can't drag between their documents all that easily because they can't see more than one document at a time. But if you go to the Window menu and choose Arrange, you can use any of these choices to see more than one document. Then there's a choice at the bottom here called Consolidate All to Tabs, and that would get you back to normal, how it usually works. But if you happen to hate tabs, then go to the Photoshop menu and choose Preferences. Or if you're in Windows, instead go to the Edit menu to find the same choice. Then when you go through here and you have all these various choices, one of the ones you want to go to is called Workspace. And within there, you're going to find a choice called Open Documents as Tabs. If I were to turn that off, then it would default when I open more than one document to having each one in its own floating window. But you got to be careful when you do that, because then if you drag one window really close to the edge of another and let go, they might combine into tabs. So if you turn off this checkbox called Enable Floating Document Window Docking, that would prevent it from ever combining 2 windows when you drag one near another. Now, I personally like tabs, so I got used to them over time, and so I leave those 2 turned on. But here's one thing I hate. It's called large tabs, and that's because at a certain point, Adobe decided they wanted to make Photoshop more friendly to touch devices, like a Microsoft Surface tablet. And by doing so, they took all these tabs that appear in Photoshop and they made them much taller so they take up more space on your screen. That makes it easier to tap on them with your finger. But I don't use my finger. I use a mouse or a graphics tablet or a trackpad, and therefore I can be very precise with where I'm clicking. And so I always turn off this checkbox called Large Tabs, and when I do, watch what happens to all these tabs up here. Now they're nice and small like they usually would be, and now they don't take up too much space. So then let's look at some other preferences. Oftentimes I have an image and I find that if I open a panel, let's say there's a panel that just kind of pops open like here, like the history panel. Well, on occasion that panel will pop over here and cover up my picture. And so when that happens, I'll end up grabbing the hand tool in Photoshop and I'll try to move my picture over, which I'm trying to do right now. And I'll find it simply won't move. And that's because if you can ever see the entire picture, where you're zoomed out far enough where you can see the entire bounds of the image, it will always be centered with default settings. Here's how to change that, because sometimes it's annoying. You have a panel that opens and covers it up. Well, if you go back to your preferences, and I think it might be in Workspace, actually I think it's in Tools. If I go to Tools, there's a checkbox called Over Scroll. I'm going to turn on the Over Scroll checkbox. It's a really simple feature, but when I click OK, now it means if I can see the entirety of my picture, I can still use the hand tool to reposition it on my screen. And therefore, if I open a panel that would usually cover up part of that picture, I can use the Move tool and get it out of the way. If I don't have that turned on, I'm annoyed anytime any of those panels cover up my image. Let's return to our preferences, and this time let's visit an area that is called Performance. In Photoshop, you have multiple undos. If you go to the Edit menu and choose Undo, you can only access one of them that way. But there's a choice called Step Backward, also under the Edit menu, and you can choose it multiple times to get back multiple steps. What's nice is there's a keyboard shortcut for it. You're probably used to the keyboard shortcut for undo, which is Command Z. Well, if you just add the Option key, then you can go back multiple steps. On Windows, that would be Alt Control Z. Type it multiple times, you can go back many different steps. Well, with default settings, Photoshop remembers 50 steps. And you can change that in your preferences. Here I'm in my preferences in a category called Performance, and I find a choice called History States. Now, I wish Adobe would have labeled that differently. I wish it would be called Undos, because then most people would be pretty obvious what it does. But this determines how many undos you can have. So if you ever do something that happens to take more than 50 steps and you try to undo that many times and you can't get back, right here is where you can change it. So I might bring this up to 75. You can bring it up a ridiculous amount. If you want to find the highest setting for anything, just type in a ridiculously high number. Like I just typed in 99 billion. Press return and it'll usually tell you the range you can put in. So I can get up to 1,000 undos. Now the problem is 1,000 undos, it's got to keep track of that somewhere. And it's going to do it in memory. Once it runs out of memory, it'll store it on your hard drive in what's known as the scratch disk. And eventually, if it has to keep track of that on a really big file with 1,000 undos, it might fill your hard drive. So I'm not going to set it to 1,000, but I might set it to 75. Now, talking about the scratch disk, if you ever do get a message that says scratch disk is full, it means your hard drive is full. The hard drive that contains your computer's operating system is full. Well, a lot of times you have more than one hard drive attached to your computer. Like right now, I have an external drive hooked up as well as my internal. And with default settings, Photoshop will only use your internal hard drive. So if that ever fills up, you'll get a message saying scratch disk is full. What I suggest you do is you have more than one hard drive, then come over here in your preferences and go to a section called Scratch Disks. When you get in there, you'll find a list of all the hard drives that are currently attached to your computer. And you'll find a little checkbox next to each one. The only checkbox that will be turned on is whichever hard drive you started up from, meaning your computer's operating system is on. Well, if you want to use the additional drives, turn on the other checkboxes. Then you can come in here and utilize more than one, and you won't get that error message called scratch disk is full now until both of those drives is full. Now, this is only going to affect Photoshop after you quit Photoshop and start it up again. Also, you can change the order of these drives. If you know that one of your hard drives is dramatically faster than the other, for instance, one of them is a spinning traditional hard drive, and the other is what's known as an SSD. Solid State Digital is what that stands for. SSD drives are dramatically faster because there's no spinning drive inside. Instead, it's just like the computer memory known as RAM. And so if this one was an SSD drive and that one was not, I would click on the fastest drive that's here, and then over on the right side, there are up and down arrows. And I would move that to the top, which means use that drive first. And only when that drive completely fills up should you switch to the second drive. Now, there are all sorts of other preferences, but those are the ones that I change most frequently, so I just wanted to share them with you.